The next 48 hours want to be about sentiment. Silver tightness is about to get stress tested by the calendar, not because a headline is coming, not because a talking head finally noticed, but because the market is walking into a window where timing matters more than opinions, and where small imbalances can suddenly become everyone's problem. And here's the conflict you need to understand up front. A lot of people want to frame silver as just another risk-on trade, something you can dismiss with a shrug about rates or a throwaway line about industrial demand. But tightness doesn't care what your narrative is. Tightness cares where the metal is, what qualifies as deliverable, and what contracts force participants to do when the clock hits a certain hour. And that's where the real pressure starts. Because the tell isn't a tweet. The tell is when the market starts acting like later is no longer an option. When a market is comfortable, it pays you to wait. When it's uncomfortable, it charges you to wait. And silver tightness shows up exactly there, in the way near-term decisions get punished, in the way liquidity thins when it matters most, and in the way price can jump like an S stepping over a crack in the floor instead of walking up the stairs. But that's not the part that matters. The part that matters is what those moves force the biggest participants to do next, and why this particular 48-hour window can make them do it all at once. Let's translate tightness into something you can actually feel. Tightness isn't a vibe. Tightness is when the market stops being about forecasting and starts being about sourcing. It's when you see urgency premiums creeping into the front end. It's when the conversation shifts from, where do you think it's going? To, can you actually get it? And if you can, what does it cost to get it right now? It's when spread behavior starts sounding alarms that spot price alone can't explain. And when that happens, you get a dangerous mix. The crowd sees only the candle, but professionals see the constraint underneath the candle. And if you only watch the candle, you'll keep asking the wrong question. You'll ask, why did it move? Instead of, what did that move break? Here is the phase shift in plain language. The market stopped arguing about direction and started arguing about availability. That's what a new phase means. In the earlier phase, silver can trend, pull back, retest, and everyone debates macro narratives. Rates up, rates down, dollar strong, dollar weak, risk on, risk off. But in the new phase, the debate becomes mechanical. The debate becomes about settlement, about who has access to which pool of bars, about financing, about timing, about the plumbing. And when a market enters that phase, it becomes far more violent because decisions get compressed. If you can't wait, you can't negotiate. If you can't negotiate, you pay. And when one player is forced to pay, it prints a price that everyone else has to respect. That's the part retail investors rarely get told in real time. And that's where the hidden detail lives. The hidden detail is brutal. Silver can be plentiful on paper and still be scarce where the benchmark is set. Read that again, because it flips the entire story. A lot of people hear tightness and immediately imagine one simplistic thing. There isn't enough silver. That's not how this breaks. Tightness can be about total supply, sure, but far more often in the real world, it's says about the wrong kind of supply in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's about availability at the margin. It's about what counts as deliverable against the contracts that actually anchor price discovery. And once you see that, you stop falling for the lazy argument that inventories exist, therefore there's no problem. Existence is not the same thing as deliverability, and deliverability is not the same thing as mobility, and mobility is not the same thing as willingness. Because if the bars are held for long-term custody or tied up in financing structures or sitting in a region where the paperwork and logistics aren't aligned with the benchmark, then for the purpose of the next 48 hours, they might as well be on the moon. Now, this is the moment where people either go full conspiracy or they get scared off by the complexity. Don't do either. You don't need villains. You don't need secret handshakes. You just need incentives, rules, and stress. In metals, especially silver, the market is layered. You've got paper instruments, futures, options, forwards, swaps. You've got physical flows, bars, vaults, refineries, shipping, insurance. You've got benchmarks and settlement rules that define what counts. And when those layers align, you get smooth price discovery. When they don't align, price discovery becomes a negotiation under duress. And negotiations under duress don't produce gentle outcomes. The next detail is what flips the whole setup. Tightness often expresses itself first in the curve, not in the headline spot price. Think about the curve like the market's heartbeat. If the curve says, we're fine, take your time, then the market is paying you to carry inventory and roll positions. If the curve starts saying, we need it now, then the market is charging you to wait. That's where contango and backwardation matter, not as textbook definitions, but as behavioral triggers. In contango, the future price is higher than the spot, which often reflects storage, financing, and convenience yield dynamics. In backwardation, the near price is higher relative to later delivery, which can signal immediate demand for availability, or a scarcity of deliverable supply at the front end, or stress around settlement. And here is the trap. People treat that as a simplistic bullish versus bearish label. That's not what you should watch. You should watch what it forces participants to do. Because if the front end is screaming and you're short the wrong part of the curve, you don't get to philosophize. You have to act. And acting under time pressure is where forced buying is born. This is also where paper versus physical becomes real without becoming reckless. Paper instruments are not fake. They are essential. They allow hedgers, producers, refiners, industrial users, and investors to manage risk. But paper pricing is still anchored to deliverability constraints at specific nodes. If a contract requires a certain type of bar or a certain delivery location, then the market can look calm from 30,000 feet and still be panicked in the engine room. That's not manipulation, that's plumbing. And the plumbing is where squeezes, real squeezes, tend to start, because the path of least resistance becomes pay up now rather than wait and hope. So what does deliverable versus non-deliverable mean in human terms? It means not every ounce is equal for settlement. Some inventory categories are eligible but not registered, or held in ways that aren't immediately available to satisfy delivery without a decision by the holder. Some metal is technically in a vault, but functionally sticky because it's backing other obligations, or because moving it requires paperwork, transport, and time. Some metal can move, but not fast enough to satisfy a near-dated crunch. And some metal can move, but the cost and risk to move it, especially when volatility spikes, makes it unattractive. So the market can have plenty of metal and still have not enough metal right now in the right form. Well, that distinction is the difference between a smooth trend and a violent phase shift. And here comes the part everyone misses when they focus on total inventory headlines. The float matters more than the stock. The float is what is available at the margin. The float is what can be mobilized without breaking something else. The float is what can be financed and delivered under current conditions. If the float shrinks because bars are locked up, because custody demand rises, because financing tightens, because trust gets shaky, because logistics become constrained, then the price you see on screen starts to behave like it's chasing a moving target. And that's where the real pressure starts. Now zoom out one click, because silver is not a closed system. It's global. And global is where the arbitrage spine matters. Here's the basic magnet. If silver is tighter in one region than another, the market will attempt to pull metal across that gap. That's what arbitrage does. It's supposed to be the stabilizer. But arbitrage is only as good as the pipes it flows through. If the pipes are clogged, by logistics lead times, by bar specifications, by financing rates, by risk limits at dealers, by regulatory friction, then the gap can persist longer than people expect. And while it persists, it doesn't just sit there politely, it creates incentives, it creates urgency, it creates a scramble for the easiest pool of deliverable metal. And that scramble shows up in spreads, in lease rates, in premiums, in the behavior of big participants who cannot afford a settlement surprise. This is where London versus the US becomes a useful mental model, not because you need to memorize vault statistics, but because it illustrates the key point. Headline holdings don't need to tell you what S-liquid at the margin. London can show large aggregate stocks and still feel tight if a big portion is immobilized, held in custody, allocated, long-term, not offered. The US can show plenty of inventory in broad terms and still have front-end deliverability stress if the wrong categories are available or if timing mismatches appear. And if you think this is academic, watch what happens when a market has to reconcile paper claims with physical logistics during a volatile window. The negotiation isn't subtle, it's immediate. Because if this one level breaks, the math changes. And speaking of math, let MS talk about the silent accelerant that turns a tight market into a wild market: options and hedging behavior. Even if you never trade options, options trade you. Because dealers who sell options often hedge, and that hedging can create feedback loops when price moves into certain areas. When there's a concentration of open interest near key strikes and price starts running through those strikes, hedging flows can amplify the move. Sometimes that creates a squeeze-like behavior, fast, reflexive, self-feeding. Sometimes it creates a snapback, violent whipsaw as hedges get adjusted. And you don't need a grand narrative for this. You just need a market with thin liquidity and a cluster of positioning. The next 48 hours matters because calendar windows often align those flows. Expiration cycles, roll periods, delivery positioning, and risk limits resetting around the week or the month. When timing compresses, hedging becomes less forgiving. That's where the real pressure starts. Now let's layer on the other accelerant: margin and forced behavior. Silver has a reputation for being a volatility machine. That's not an insult, it's a property. High beta, sharp moves, deep emotions, and in leverage markets, sharp moves trigger mechanical responses. If margins rise or if volatility spikes, participants have to post more collateral. If they can't, they reduce exposure. Reducing exposure often means selling into weakness or buying into strength depending on which side they're on. That is how you get those weird days where price dumps hard, even though the story didn't what it change, or price rips even though the headlines are quiet. The story didn't change, the collateral requirements did. And collateral doesn't care about your thesis. Collateral cares about now, but that's not the part that matters. The part that matters is that a tight market with forced selling can paradoxically get tighter, because forced selling often removes the very intermediaries who provide liquidity. Liquidity thins, spreads widen, and the next wave of orders moves price more than it should. That's how air pockets form. That's how gaps happen. So if you're watching this as a retail investor, here's the key reframe. Stop thinking of silver as a single price. Start thinking of silver as a system under stress. The system has multiple dials: curve shape, deliverability, location, financing, hedging flows, physical premiums, industrial procurement behavior. You don't need every dial to flash red to have a problem. You need one dial to force behavior in a narrow window. And the next 48 hours is exactly the kind of window where narrow stress can become broad price action. Because the calendar doesn't negotiate. The calendar just arrives. Now let's build the proof stacking in a way that actually earns trust. Not one argument, multiple layers. First layer, term structure behavior. If the front end is acting urgent relative to later delivery, that tells you the market is assigning value to immediacy. Second layer, inventory categories and float. If reported totals are steady, but the float is constrained because metal is tied up or not offered, that has tightness in practice, regardless of headlines. Third layer, regional dislocation. If the benchmark region is drawing down its readily available pool faster than it can be replenished, you get local tightness that can ripple into global pricing. Fourth layer, institutional constraints. Dealers and funds have risk limits. When volatility rises, their capacity to intermediate shrinks, which can intensify moves. Fifth layer, physical symptoms. Premiums, availability, delivery times. These are messy, imperfect signals, but when they align with curve stress and dislocation, they matter. Sixth layer, if you want it, chart structure. A market that keeps reclaiming prior resistance and holding it, or that repeatedly fails and rejects, is telling you about acceptance or exhaustion. And that's where the real pressure starts. Now, let us talk about what everyone wants to ask. So where is silver going in the next 48 hours? The honest answer is the direction is less important than the behavior, because tight markets don't move in straight lines. They whip, they trap, they punish certainty. You can have the right thesis and the wrong timing and still get rinsed. So the disciplined approach is not to demand a prophecy. It's to build a decision tree. And that decision tree starts with levels and reactions, not with feelings. What does that look like? It looks like watching whether silver holds key support zones after a push. It looks like watching whether breakouts get accepted, meaning price moves above a level and then, when it retests, it holds and bids show up. It looks like watching whether rallies fade immediately, meaning the market is still supply heavy and using strength to unload risk. It looks like watching the speed of the tape. Tightness tends to show up as speed. Not always, but often. Slow grind is one thing, sudden vertical moves into thin liquidity is another, and if the market starts doing that into a known calendar window, pay attention. Because if this one level breaks, the math changes. But here's the most important part. Tightness regimes can produce both a squeeze up and a liquidation down. People get this wrong. They think tightness only means up. Tightness means unstable. It means sensitive. It means prone to discontinuities. If a big participant needs metal now, price can spike. If a big participant gets margin called, price can dump. Both can be true inside the same week. That's why your risk framing matters more than your narrative. So let S lock in the why now. Without guessing specific dates, you don't T control. This 48-hour window matters because near-term liquidity is often thinner than people think, and because positioning often gets adjusted around predictable calendar landmarks. Option cycles and dealer hedging can concentrate flows. Delivery windows and roll decisions can compress urgency. Month-end or quarter-end risk management can force funds to reduce or rebalance. And when the market is already tight, meaning the float is constrained, those calendar mechanics hit harder. It's like a bridge with less slack in the cables. The same wind gust produces a bigger swing. And that's where the real pressure starts. Now, counterpoints. Because if you don't name them, you don't deserve trust. Tightness can ease fast. It can ease if metal reflows into the stressed region. It can ease if financing conditions shift and carrying inventory becomes more attractive, encouraging holders to lend or sell. It can ease if volatility crushes demand temporarily, especially if leveraged participants get forced out and discretionary buyers step back. It can ease if industrial users slow procurement because prices jump too quickly and they can substitute timing. It can ease if the narrative flips and the dollar spikes or real rates surge, pressuring metals broadly. It can also ease if the market simply front runs the stress, and then when the calendar passes, the urgency premium evaporates. That happens. Tightness can be real and still resolve with a sharp pullback. But that's not the part that matters. The part that matters is whether the underlying constraints actually unwind, or whether the pullback is just the market resetting leverage before the next wave. So how do you protect yourself psychologically in a market like this? Because the market will absolutely try to use your emotions against you. It will give you the perfect candle to buy right before a flush. It will give you the perfect flush to sell right before a rip. It will make you feel smart, then punish you for feeling smart. The weapon is not the headline. The weapon is regret. And the defense is a process. Here's the simplest shield. Separate trend signal from noise. Noise is a sudden move that doesn't change the structure. Price spikes and immediately gives it back, or dumps and immediately recovers, without follow-through and without acceptance. Trend signal is when the market breaks a key level and then holds it through time, even with volatility. Time is the filter. Not minutes. Not one candle, time. And in the next 48 hours, your job is not to be the hero. Your job is to avoid being the liquidity for someone else's forced decision. That means sizing for volatility. It means assuming whipsaws are normal, not exceptional. It means knowing your time frame. Are you watching this as a short-term tactical trade, a swing position, a long-term allocation? Those are different games. It means defining invalidation. What would make your thesis wrong, not merely uncomfortable. And it means being honest. If your plan requires perfect timing, it's not a plan. It's a hope. And hope is expensive in silver. Now, let's turn this into a near-term roadmap without promising you guaranteed outcomes. 2 scenarios. Clean. Simple. No drama. Scenario 1 is the controlled pullback and retest. In this scenario, silver has already signaled tightness, but the market needs to digest. You get a pullback into prior breakout areas. You get volatility that looks scary, but is actually a test of acceptance. What confirms this scenario? You see price dip into a known zone and then stabilize. You see rebounds that hold more than they fade. You see the market stop making lower lows on the intraday noise. You see dips bought with less and less follow-through to the downside. And crucially, you see that the pullback doesn't resolve the underlying plumbing stress, meaning the urgency doesn't vanish. It just cools. In this scenario, the risk is that people get shaken out by the chop, but the structure remains constructive. The opportunity is that it offers a cleaner entry for patient participants. But the invalidation is clear. If the market breaks down through key support and fails to reclaim it, then what looked like a controlled retest becomes a rejection. And if that happens, the math changes. Scenario 2 is the continuation squeeze with gap risk. In this scenario, the tightness expresses itself as urgency that overwhelms liquidity. Price pushes through key overhead levels and doesn't give you a polite pullback. It runs. You see fast expansions. You see air pockets. You see shorts forced to cover into rising prices. You see dealer hedging flows adding fuel. And you see anyone who waited for the perfect entry left staring at a chart that never came back. What confirms this scenario? Speed and persistence. Rallies that don't fade. Breakouts that don't fail. Pullbacks that are shallow and immediately bid. And a general sense that the market is paying up for immediacy. The danger in this scenario is obvious. It can reverse just as violently. Tightness-driven squeezes are notorious for snapping back, because once the forced buying is done, the market can suddenly feel empty of marginal buyers. That's why you don't confuse a squeeze candle with a stable trend. But if the squeeze scenario is in play, the game becomes about managing gap risk, not about winning an argument. Now, what should you watch in the next week or two that actually matters, beyond vibes? Watch how silver behaves around prior breakout zones. Does it hold or fail? Watch the rhythm. Does volatility expand and then compress constructively? Or does it expand and then break structure? Watch the curve behavior and front-end urgency signals. Do they cool or do they stay persistent? Watch signs of regional dislocation easing or worsening. Do flows seem to relieve stress, or does the market keep bidding for immediacy? Watch for the classic silver trick. A violent flush that looks like the end, followed by a fast reclaim that tells you it was a liquidation, not a reversal. And watch for the other classic trick, a breakout that looks like confirmation, followed by a failure to hold that level, which often means the move was positioning, not supply. Because if this one level breaks, the math changes. If you are skeptical of institutions, and a lot of you are, that skepticism is healthy as long as it stays rational. The market isn't a morality play, it's a risk transfer machine. Institutions don't need to be evil to behave in ways that feel unfair. They just need incentives. If volatility rises, they reduce risk. If inventory is constrained, they protect deliverability. If financing tightens, they pull back from making markets. If hedging flows demand action, they act. That's not a conspiracy. That's a system responding to stress. And if you want to survive in that system, you don't fight it with anger. You read it with mechanics. So let ORS bring it back to the opening verdict. The next 48 hours is an audit window. It's when calendar pressure, liquidity conditions, and positioning can collide with a tight physical reality at the margin. It's when the market decides whether tightness is just a story that fades or a constraint that forces behavior. And the key insight, the one that most mainstream takes miss, is that this can all happen even if total inventory numbers look fine, even if headlines are quiet, even if the narrative doesn't change, because the story is not total ounces. The story is deliverable ounces in the right place at the right time, and what contracts force participants to do when they can't wait. One more thing before we close, because it is the part people only learn after they get burned. The market will use volatility to separate you from your plan. It will make you feel late when patience would serve you. It will make you feel wrong when you're merely early. It will make you oversize when you should be cautious, and undersize when your setup is actually clean. Your edge, if you have one, is not predicting the next candle. Your edge is refusing to be emotionally drafted into someone else's forced trade. And if you're still here, you're already doing what most people don't. You're watching the plumbing, not just the headline. Keep it that way. In the comments, don't tell me what you hope happens. Tell me what you're watching. One level that matters, one signal that would confirm the controlled retest, and one signal that would confirm the squeeze scenario. That's how a real community thinks. Because if we're going to play in a market as reflexive and as sharp as silver, we don't win by being loud. We win by being prepared.